A friend of Oscar Pistorius tells the court he had a big love for weapons as he testifies at his trial for murder. And Pistorius' defence counsel throws doubt on the pathologist's autopsy findings on Reeva Steenkamp. Good evening from Pretoria, where a close friend of Oscar Pistorius has been giving evidence in the second week of his trial. Darren Fresco said Pistorius was mad to have fired a gun out of the sunroof of a car they were travelling in. Pistorius, he said, laughed after firing the shot. Fresco has been called by the state prosecutor, who, as part of his case, is trying to build a portrait of Pistorius as a man obsessed with weapons and a disrespect of the law. Pistorius faces a number of firearms charges as well as being accused of the premeditated murder of his girlfriend. Paul Harrison reports.
Following a day of graphic evidence about the injuries he'd inflicted on girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp, a more composed Oscar Pistorius arrived to hear friend Darren Fresco describe two separate occasions he'd witnessed the Olympian letting off a firearm. The first was with friends at Tasha's restaurant in Johannesburg. Fresco had passed his gun under the table as Pistorius had expressed an interest in buying a similar one.
We had been to the shooting range before, and I knew he had a big love for weapons, and having been around them for a long time, my assumption was that he had competency with it. Whilst leaning forward, I said to him, "There is one up."
Your head positions at that time in relation to you and the accused, how would you describe that?
Fairly close at that specific time, my lady.
What then happened?
He had then taken the weapon under the table. Now, having warned that there was one up, I'd seen a shoulder gesture, which I had assumed was cycling the existing bullet out of the chamber. After him having taken the weapon and having cycled one out, what I don't think he had realised at the time, that he had cycled another bullet into the chamber of the gun. And at that specific moment, he had pulled the trigger to, at the time, supposedly make it safe. None of us had known where the shot had gone off.
What was the accused's reaction?
Instantly, he had passed the weapon back to me under the table, and he said, "Please, there's too much media hype around me at the moment. Please, can you take the rap for it?"
But for Pistorius' legal team, there were crucial omissions in Fresco's original statement. No mention of Pistorius' request that his friend take the blame. No mention either of a story that had been fabricated to protect the athlete.
If Mr. Pistorius had asked you to take the blame for the shot going off, it was easy to put that in your statement.
Correct.
Did you?
I did not.
Why did you not?
I do not know why I did not.
You made up a story that the firearm fell out of your pocket. Why did you not put it in that Section 204 statement?
I do not know, my lady.
Fresco, who'd earlier been told he'd be immune from prosecution over gun violations if he told the truth, was then asked why he'd also made no mention of his instruction to Pistorius the gun was one up or had a bullet in the chamber, and that it was acknowledged with an OK by Pistorius.
If my memory serves me correctly, that's what I remember, that I had moved forward, he had moved forward, and we were in close proximity of each other.
That close proximity, I ask you if you remember, also does not appear in your statement. Did he say okay?
Yes, he did.
You see, that is evidence of great significance. In main evidence, in your statement, I will put it to you, and even in the earlier cross-examination. There was no reference to it. It's the first time that this comes out. Can you explain that?
I can't.
Then an admission likely to play into the hands of Pistorius' legal team keen to discredit state witnesses. Fresco confirmed he'd been following the evidence concerning him on social and mainstream media.
Previous witnesses referred to tracksuit pants.
I saw that, and I never ever wear tracksuit pants unless I'm going to gym.
What do you mean you saw that, Mr. Fresco?
It's been on Twitter.
So you've been following that part of the evidence?
There are bits and pieces that I see on the news. Doesn't matter where you look, where you turn, where you go, what you listen to, what you watch. It's all over the media, my lady. If I'm watching the news, it's all over the news. If I'm listening to the radio, it's all over the radio.
I understand that, Mr. Fresco. I'm not blaming you for that. I just need to know that you followed the proceedings.
Not entirely, no.
I understand not entirely, but at least when it was relevant to your evidence, you must. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, it is, my lady.
Turning to events leading to the second incident, firing a gun out of a sunroof of a car, a charge Pistorius denies, the prosecution was keen to paint a clearer picture of the Olympian's relationship with firearms. Fresco, Pistorius and the athlete's ex-girlfriend Samantha Taylor had been stopped for speeding. One of the officers inspected Pistorius' gun lying on the passenger seat.
The accused had replied, "You can't just touch another man's gun."
So when the policeman cleared the firearm and ejected the one bullet, what happened? What did the accused do?
He started telling the officer, "Now your fingerprints are all over my gun, so if something happens, you are then going to be liable for anything that had happened." His firearm license had been given to the Metro police officer, to which he asked him a question, "Mr. Pretorius." Then he said, "Well, actually, if you could read, it would state Mr. Pistorius." We had then gone towards the Athol Square. We landed up at the Gourmet Garage for dinner, my lady.
Something else happened en route.
Without prior warning, he shot out the sunroof. Instinctively, I had literally just moved over to the right-hand side of the vehicle, seeing that the noise had gone off above my left ear.
Did you say anything?
Apologies for my language, my lady, but I asked him if he was mad.
What did he say?
He just laughed, my lady. By that stage, it literally felt as if my ear was bleeding.
Barry Rue's cross-examination then brought to light the three had in fact been pulled over by police more than once that day.
What was the first occasion for?
For not having a number plate affixed to the vehicle.
And what happened there?
We had got a fine for that.
What happened to the fine?
The fine had been paid.
Who paid it?
From the dealership had paid it.
Who's the dealership?
Santon Auto.
Pistorius' legal team then revealed in kilometres per hour the speed Darren Fresco was driving at when the car was stopped a second time.
What was the maximum speed you were doing in a day?
I can't remember that day.
260 on the speedometer? Because that's something that you should remember.
I can't remember how fast I was driving that day.
Mr. Fresco, I've never travelled 260, but what I want to say to you, of course, if I do, that's something that I will remember. That's why I ask you, don't you remember something like that?
No, I don't.
In her evidence last week, Pistorius' ex-girlfriend Samantha Taylor, also in the car that day, suggested Fresco and Pistorius together discussed shooting a robot or traffic light, venting frustrations over being stopped by police. Not so, argued Fresco. The discrepancy helping Barry Rue blur the reliability of testimonies from two people who supposedly witnessed the same incident.
Before the firing of the shot, there was no warning that it was about to happen.
No.
There was no talking about it.
None, my lady.
There was no irritation about it.
No, because this was quite a long time after we had been stopped.
There was no one being furious about anything before.
No.
There was no one laughing about it.
No.
Out of the blue.
Out of the blue,
No warning.
None, my lady.
I'm just trying to think what we should do and how I should treat the evidence of Ms. Taylor, where she said that Oscar and Darren were pretty anxious and a little bit irritated with the policeman. And so they laughed and they said that they wanted to shoot a robot. And then Oscar shot a bullet out of the sunroof. That would not be true according to you.
Not what I remember.
I'm trying to understand how it is that you have two people in a car that can differ so dramatically about when and where and why the shot was allegedly fired. Can you assist us?
My testimony is the truth, my lady. That's what I remember.
Mr. Pistorius will deny that he fired that shot?
That is incorrect.
Welcome back to Pretoria, where earlier this morning Professor Gert Simon was recalled to continue his evidence on the autopsy on Riva Steenkamp. Yesterday, Professor Simon told the court that he estimated Riva had eaten her last meal about 2 hours before her death. She was shot dead by Pistorius at just after 3:15 in the morning. Pistorius maintains that they'd gone to bed much earlier, at around 10, and he'd shot her thinking she was an intruder. Earlier, we took a trip to a gun range near Pretoria to have a look at a Glock pistol. We were shown a weapon similar to the Glock 27 gun that Darren Fresco said he passed to Oscar Pistorius under a table at Tasha's restaurant in Johannesburg, the gun that went off accidentally. The weapon we examined shares the same firing mechanism as the Glock 27. We were interested to find out how easy it would be to fire the gun by accident.
If it is loaded one up and I drop it accidentally, this firearm, according to Glock, cannot go off, cannot misfire. In other words, dropping it. But let's say, for instance, I've got an example. Let me take mine. It hooks on here on some other mysterious way. And now I'm going to pull it. Now you've got to remember, I've got to make sure that I catch that little lever, then it can fire, yes. But handling the firearm, taking it underneath the table, yes, there is a possibility that it can hook on something. We don't know. But by dropping it, no. And the only way that the Glock will fire is by depressing that little lever and the trigger.
Defence counsel Barry Rue arrived this morning primed to question the professor about his findings. Without the TV cameras looking on, his evidence is judged to be too graphic, Professor Simon had to vouch for his own expertise, telling the court he'd carried out between 10 to 15,000 autopsies over a 30-year career. Again, the focus was on the somewhat grisly subject of the contents of Riva Steenkamp's stomach. The professor testified that although it was not an exact science, he judged she had eaten only 2 hours before death, much later than the defence case maintains. He said there were traces of vegetables in her stomach. Under cross-examination, Professor Simon admitted he didn't consider himself an expert in this particular field, and that different people digested food at different speeds. Joining us to discuss today's evidence is Professor Dirk van Pappendorp, our own pathology expert, who is head of the physiology department at the University of Pretoria. Alex Crawford, our special correspondent, who's been in court throughout the trial, and John Welsh from the South Africa Gun Owners Association. Can I start with you, Professor? You've heard that the pathologist described studying the contents of a stomach, and particularly the emptying, the speed at which a stomach empties, is not an exact science.
I would say it is scientific in the sense that the ways that they do it is by barium follow through and taking x-rays on at different times. That is one way. The other way is by swallowing a pellet of nuclear technetium. It's a radioactive material, and then with a Geiger teller they can determine what the time of stomach empty and the follow-through in the gutties.
I think one of the points he emphasised is that we're all different. Our stomachs are different.
Various factors will play a role in stomach emptying. If you're talking about food specifically, then carbohydrates is easily, and I would say it depends on the literature, what you're reading, but they say about 75% of the stomach should be empty by 90 minutes, and about 100% at 120 minutes, at 2 hours. But I would say they are also in the literature 2 to 3 hours. That is the average time. A little bit longer if it's pork chops, fatty meal.
How does the emotional state of somebody affect this process? Because that's a key part of this trial.
I think that is important. The body consists of the autonomic nervous system, which is two parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, if you are emotionally, if you're in a fight situation or argument, then the sympathetic nervous system will be stimulated, and that will inhibit stomach emptying.
So it would make it slower?
It will make it slower. So if everyone is relaxed, you have a glass of wine, some nice food, then the normal stomach emptying will take place.
Pathologist was under cross-examination today, particularly around that specific area. He was a very precise witness, but do you feel that Barry Roux for the defence scored many points off him?
I don't think so, actually. I thought Professor Simon was an absolutely formidable witness. He was very, very thorough. He stood to attention the entire time he gave his evidence, which was over 2 days. Everyone else has sat down. And he was very thorough, very measured, very matter-of-fact. You gleaned, even when he was describing the injuries, that he was extremely thorough, mentioning absolutely everything that was on Riva Steenkamp's body, and that went over into the contents of her stomach. He gave a very long explanation about why he wasn't an expert, but then he backed it up by saying that this was his theory, his conclusion, or his assessment was based on a decade, 3 decades of a career that involved this, and he was well used to investigating this, and he took the only time you saw him slightly showing a bit of irritation towards Barry Roux was when Barry Roux was questioning his expertise. Barry Roux was referring to one article, and the professor sort of reminded him that not only had he at least half a dozen articles in front of him, he'd also spent 30 years studying this and reading up about it and practicing it.
We've got used to Barry Roux as a bit of a Rottweiler. I mean, he's really been the star, in a sense, of this whole trial. Today he was pretty meek and mild.
He was very respectful towards the pathologist, definitely. I thought he showed a much more respect towards him than he has done towards all the other witnesses, most of whom are just ordinary civilians.
What picture today emerged of Oscar Pistorius and guns?
Well, we heard more evidence from a friend, I think probably safe to say a former friend now, because he's testified very definitely against Oscar Pistorius. He's challenged his recollection of events on 2 occasions. He talked about him firing a gun out of a sunroof, the car that he was driving. This man is Darren Fresco, and another gun incident when the gun went off at Tash's restaurant in Johannesburg. And Mr. Fresco was trying to paint a picture of a man who was obsessed with guns, who had a love of weapons, who was perhaps reckless, and who obviously didn't want to take responsibility for his actions. Now, on this occasion, I think Barry Roux did score quite a few points. He really tore apart Darren Fresco's testimony, questioning why he'd left out very, very key parts of evidence, such as Mr. Pistorius allegedly asking him to take the blame, why he hadn't mentioned that when he first went to his lawyers. He certainly suggested quite heavily that Mr. Fresco was more trying to save his own skin than tell the truth. And he went on to suggest that perhaps Mr. Fresco had based a lot of his evidence on hearing coverage of this trial through television, radio and Twitter, and I think that was very damning for Mr. Fresco as a witness.
John, let me turn to you. You're the gun expert here. We've heard, as Alex said, Pistorius described today as somebody with a big love of guns. He owned his own gun. We understand that he was, at the time of the shooting, applying for licences for a number of other weapons. How typical is he of middle-class male South Africans?
Well, if we talk about gun ownership in the first instance, if we look at about 50 million inhabitants of this country, and we look at about 1.6 million firearms owners owning approximately 2.2 million firearms. That is what difficulty is in this regard. So amongst about 1.6 million firearms owners owing firearms, that is nothing strange to owe those type of firearms. One must remember that in terms of the South African law, is first of all a very strict procedure in order to get licensed. Secondly, one is limited with regards to the number of firearms that one may owe. For instance, the ordinary man, ordinary woman may not own more than one handgun or shotgun for self-defense and not more than 3 others.
Black Talon bullets that cause maximum damage. Why would anybody want those kind of bullets?
Those are typical self-defense bullets. Over many years, the Americans, from where we take the lead as well, and because they are the greatest manufacturers as well, they have, through their research, they have established that an ordinary military round-nosed bullet does not cause much damage. Yes, it can cause killing, but one must remember that in a self-defense situation where there is violence involved, you want to stop the attacker as quickly as possible, and that you do with a bullet of that nature.
That's it for today. Remember, you can watch continuing coverage of the Pistorius trial on Sky News at 7:30 in the morning and a special programme at 9:30.